Altoona, Pennsylvania, October 1896. The air carried the scent of coal smoke and cooling iron, the constant perfume of the Pennsylvania Railroad's sprawling locomotive shops. On a forgotten spur of track, surrounded by weeds and discarded steel shavings, Mikuláš Kollár was doing something no one could understand. He was building a house. Not on a foundation of fieldstone, but inside the hollow, rusting shell of a decommissioned 36-foot PRR boxcar. Hubert Trentham, the division foreman, walked down the track with two of his best yard men, Amos Weaver and Silas Blackwood. Trentham was a man whose authority was written in the lines around his eyes and the permanent grease under his fingernails. He stopped 20 feet from the boxcar, his hands on his hips. Inside the cavernous metal space, the rhythmic tap of Kollár's hammer echoed unnaturally. "Kollár!" Trentham's voice was accustomed to cutting through the din of the roundhouse. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" Mikuláš Kollár emerged, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a thick-wristed hand. He was not a large man, but he was built of dense, compact muscle, a human tool designed for patient, powerful work. "I am building a home, Mr. Trentham." Amos Weaver let out a short, sharp laugh. "A home? In a scrap-heap boxcar? Mikuláš, that thing's an oven in the summer and a block of ice in the winter. You'll freeze your family solid." "It's worse than foolish, it's illegal," Trentham stated, his voice flat and final. He pointed a finger at the faded railroad markings on the car's side. "That car is retired, but it's still company property. It's subject to a reclamation lien. The moment the Home Office decides to scrap this line, they'll hook a shifter to it and drag it to the foundry, with or without your family inside. The company police will have you out by January. Mark my words." Kollár looked at the foreman, then at the boxcar, then back at the foreman. His English was careful, deliberate. "The paper I signed said I could clear it for the price of the scrap." "The paper lets you haul off the wood and iron, Kollár, not squat in it," Trentham corrected him. "You're a madman, wasting your time and your money on a metal coffin." He shook his head, a gesture of both pity and frustration, and turned to walk away. The word spread through the shop town like a grass fire. The quiet Slovak, the strange one who kept to himself, was building a house inside an iron box. It was the damnedest, most foolish thing anyone had ever seen. What did this Slovak wagon stolarz, this railway coach carpenter from a world away, understand about layered isolation and the brutal physics of cold that a division foreman, a man who lived and breathed the railroad, had tragically missed? If you stick with me through this story, I promise you will understand the profound and life-saving difference between a simple wall and a true thermal break. You'll learn a principle of building science that was perfected in the luxury rail cars of the 19th century and is still fundamental to how we stay warm today. Let me know in the comments below, what's the coldest you've ever been? And what was the one thing you wished you had to keep warm? Your support for this channel by subscribing and liking this video allows me to keep uncovering these forgotten stories of frontier genius. Mikuláš Kollár was not a house carpenter. He had never framed a pitched roof, never set a joist for a two-story dwelling. He was a wagon stolarz, a man whose entire working life had been spent inside the long, narrow confines of railway coaches in the sprawling yards of Bratislava. His hands knew the precise curve of mahogany panels for a dining car, the intricate joinery of a Pullman sleeper's fold-down berth, the secret to installing plate glass windows that wouldn't shatter under the constant vibration of the rails. Most importantly, he knew how to build a rolling room that could keep a government minister comfortable at 60 degrees Fahrenheit while the car sat overnight in a Polish rail yard at 10 below zero. He understood that a wall was not a single thing, but a system of layers, each with a specific job. He had brought his wife, Katarina, and their two children, 8-year-old Joseph and 6-year-old Anna, to Altoona 2 years prior. He was a good worker, valued for his skill with wood, but the pay of a yard carpenter was a fraction of what a road engineer made. They lived in a company tenement, a hastily built clapboard box that was no match for an Appalachian winter. Their first winter in Pennsylvania had been a lesson in misery, a brutal education in the science of heat loss. Mikuláš never forgot the sight of the water tin on the horse stall they rented. By December, the lid, a simple sheet of metal, had a bulge of ice pushing up from below. That bulge grew, pressing the lid into a permanent convex bow that did not relax its shape until the first thaw in March. Inside their tenement, the small kitchen ash pan, set on the floor a few feet from the stove, would freeze solid to the pine boards between the evening and morning cleanings. He'd had to use a chisel to pry it loose, the frozen ash scattering like gray dust. Under their bed, a tannery sheepskin they'd bought for extra warmth cured board stiff in the frigid air that seeped up through the floorboards. Katerina and the children slept in their coats, their breath pluming in the air of the bedroom. Mikuláš would lie awake, listening to the wind knife through the walls, feeling the heat from their small stove being stolen, sucked away into the merciless cold. He wasn't just losing warmth, he was losing money, burning through cord after cord of wood just to keep the misery at bay. He had sworn he would not face another winter like that. He would build them a proper home, a warm home, but he would build it the only way he knew how. The problem with the company tenements, and indeed almost every frontier cabin in the region, was not a lack of wood or a lack of effort. The problem was a fundamental misunderstanding of how cold travels. The problem was the thermal bridge. The houses were built from single layers of thick sawn lumber, often with studs running directly from the exterior, sheathing to the interior plaster or paneling. Every single nail, every single stud, was a direct highway for heat to escape and for cold to enter. Heat moves through solid objects via conduction. A hot stove burner heats the bottom of a cast iron pan, and soon the handle is too hot to touch. The heat has conducted through the solid metal. The same principle worked in reverse in the Altoona tenements. The bitter tendichernify air outside chilled the clapboard siding. That cold leached directly through the wooden studs and iron nails to the interior walls. The stove could pump out heat, but the walls were constantly, actively bleeding it away. Families like the Weavers in the Blackwoods burned through 3, sometimes 4 cords of wood a winter, their stoves glowing red hot, yet the indoor temperature rarely climbed above 50 degrees. Condensation would form on the cold interior walls, turning to frost in the corners of the rooms. It was a battle of brute force, fought with endless loads of firewood, and it was a battle they were always losing. The settlers understood insulation in its simplest form. They chinked logs with mud and moss. But they didn't understand the far more insidious enemy, the conductive pathway created by the very structure of their homes. They were living inside beautifully crafted, fatally flawed instruments of heat transfer. Mikuláš Kollár, looking at these houses, saw the same design flaw he'd seen in poorly made freight cars designed to carry produce. He knew that to defeat the cold, you couldn't just build a thick wall. You had to build a smart wall. You had to break the bridge. His work began not with a hammer, but with a crowbar and a heavy sledge. He spent a week gutting the old boxcar, stripping it down to its iron skeleton and oak plank floor. The railroad had sold it to him for $17, the going rate for its weight in scrap iron and reclaimable wood. He then spent another $10 on materials that made his neighbors certain he had lost his mind. He didn't buy lumber or siding. He bought 50-pound bales of raw, greasy wool felt bat, the kind used for packing steam fittings, and massive 2-inch thick sheets of cork, normally used for industrial refrigeration. His first step was to attack the most neglected thermal bridge, the floor. The boxcar sat on railroad ties laid directly on the frozen ballast bed of the spur. The ground was a giant permanent heat sink. To live on a floor directly connected to it was to invite the cold up into your bones. Mikuláš laid the 2-inch cork sheets over the entire oak floor of the boxcar, edge to edge, creating a continuous, unbroken layer. He was decoupling his home from the frozen earth. Next, he built the frame for his house inside the house. Using simple pine 2x4s, he constructed a freestanding inner cabin within the boxcar. The crucial detail was that this inner frame never once touched the iron shell. He built it 6 inches away from the metal walls on all sides. Where it needed to be stabilized, he didn't use nails or bolts. He drilled holes and used thick wooden dowels or pegs to connect his inner frame to the outer structure. He was meticulously eliminating every potential metal-to-metal or wood-to-metal contact point. He was building a house that floated, thermally speaking, inside its protective shell. Into this 6-inch cavity, this no-man's land between the iron skin and his wooden interior, he began to pack the wool felt. He stuffed it in methodically, layer by layer, ensuring there were no gaps, no thin spots. The thick, oily wool was a miserable material to work with, but Kollár knew its secret. The loosely packed fibers trapped millions of tiny pockets of air, and still air is one of the most effective and cheapest insulators on the planet. Hubert Trentham made it a point to walk by every few days, his skepticism a cold aura around him. "Still at it, Kollár? You know, the yardmaster was asking about this car. Mentioned the reclamation clause. You're building a fine nest for the foundry furnace." Mikuláš just nodded, not pausing his work. "The wool will keep it warm," he said, more to himself than to the foreman. "The wool will make a fine home for rats," Amos Weaver chimed in, laughing. "And when the company police put you and your family out in the snow, I suppose you'll tell your children the rats will keep them warm." Finally, Kollár began on the interior walls. He used simple, half-inch tongue and groove pine, creating a clean, smooth, warm, wooden room. To an observer standing inside, it looked like a small, well-made pine cabin. It was only when you looked at the deep-set windows and the thick 10-inch door frame that you realized the truth. You were not in a simple cabin. You were in the innermost chamber of a highly engineered thermal machine. The total cost of his materials, beyond the initial scrap price of the car, was $38.50, less than the cost of 2 cords of winter firewood. To understand the genius of what Mikuláš Kollár built, you have to understand 3 kinds of heat transfer: conduction, convection, and radiation. While all 3 were at play, his design was a masterclass in defeating the most relentless of them in a Pennsylvania winter: conduction. Conduction is heat transfer through direct contact. As we discussed, it's why the handle of a skillet gets hot. In the context of a house, the brutal Appalachian cold touches the outside wall, and that thermal energy, or lack thereof, is conducted directly through the solid materials of the wall to the inside. The efficiency of this transfer is measured by a material's R value. A high R value means high resistance to heat flow. A low R value means low resistance. A standard single-plank wall of a company tenement in Altoona with its studs and nails had a composite R value of perhaps R2 or R3. It was barely better than a heavy canvas tent. Now look at Kollár's system. It was a sandwich of R values. The outer layer was the 1/8-inch iron shell. Its R value was nearly 0. It was a fantastic conductor, but its job wasn't to insulate. Its job was to be the weatherproof, windproof barrier. It stopped the wind and the rain completely. The next layer was the 6-inch gap he had packed with wool felt batting. Raw wool felt has an R value of about 3 per inch. 6 inches of it gave him an R value of 18. This was the heart of the engine. The millions of air pockets trapped in the wool fibers dramatically slowed down the process of conduction. Heat trying to escape from the inner cabin had to navigate this torturous, fluffy maze. The cold, trying to get in, faced the same obstacle. Finally, there was the inner wall of half-inch pine. Wood is a decent insulator, adding another R1 to the system. But its primary purpose was psychological and practical. It created a warm, dry, comfortable living space. The most critical element, however, was the break between the layers. By using wooden dowels instead of iron nails to connect his inner frame, he avoided creating thermal superhighways. The 2-inch cork floor, with an R value of R7, did the same for the ground. It was a dam against the endless ocean of cold locked in the earth. The entire living space, floor, walls, and ceiling, was encapsulated in a continuous, unbroken blanket of high R-value insulation. He hadn't just built thick walls. He had created a system where each component performed a specialized task, resulting in a whole that was exponentially more effective than the sum of its parts. He had replicated the core principle of a Pullman sleeper car, a box within a box, separated by a layer of trapped, still air. That December, the winter came not with snow, but with ice. A warm, wet system from the south collided with a mass of Arctic air parked over the Appalachians. For 4 straight days, the temperature hovered at the freezing point as a relentless, wind-driven rain fell. It wasn't rain, and it wasn't sleet. It was freezing rain. Every surface it touched, it coated in a layer of clear, heavy glaze. Tree branches grew thick as a man's arm, then sagged and cracked with reports like rifle shots. Telegraph wires became inch-thick cables of ice until they snapped under their own impossible weight. Every roof in Altoona and the surrounding 3 counties was encased in a shell of ice that grew to be 3 inches thick. Then, on the 5th day, the wind arrived. A gale-force blast of Arctic air screamed down from the north, gusting to 70 miles per hour. The ice-laden roofs of the conventional homes became a catastrophic liability. The wind found purchase under the eaves of the shake and shingle roofs. It lifted, and the immense weight of the ice did the rest. Roofs were not just damaged, they were torn off in huge sections, crashing into yards and streets. The night was filled with the sound of splintering wood and the terrified shouts of families exposed to the elements. For those whose roofs held, the battle was far from over. The temperature plummeted. For 6 consecutive nights, the thermometer in front of the divisional office registered 16 degrees below zero. The wind howled, driving the cold into every crack and crevice of the damaged, inadequate houses. It was a disaster. The town hall was converted into a shelter for dozens of families whose homes were rendered uninhabitable. Through it all, the strange boxcar on the forgotten spur sat silent. The wind, unable to find a shingle or an eave on its curved metal roof, screamed over it without effect. The 3-inch thick armor of ice that coated its iron sides remained perfectly intact, an undisturbed testament to the storm's fury. Inside, the Kollár family was not just surviving, they were living. A single small potbelly stove consuming a fraction of the wood their neighbors burned kept the interior space at a steady 65 degrees. The air was still and quiet. The only sound was the gentle hiss of the stove and the faint, happy bubbling of a large glass jar that sat on a shelf near the kitchen area. Inside the jar was Katarina's matka oktu, her precious mother of vinegar, a living culture she used to make the sharp, fermented base for kapusniak, the beloved Slovak sauerkraut soup. It was a delicate process, requiring a stable temperature above 50 degrees to thrive. In the quiet warmth of the boxcar, the culture was alive and well. Domestic warmth technique. Katarina was at the small pine table, humming a song from the old country as she rolled out dough for dumplings. The air smelled of yeast, simmering pork, and the faint, sweet tang of active fermentation. The cold wasn't a wolf at the door. It was a rumor from another world. Hubert Trentham spent the 2 days after the wind died down in a state of grim, exhausted duty. His job was to assess the damage to Pennsylvania Railroad property, specifically the dozens of company tenements that housed its workers. The scene was one of uniform devastation. He walked from house to house, his boots crunching on fallen ice and splintered wood. He saw entire roofs peeled back, revealing rooms filled with frozen, snow-dusted furniture. He saw families huddled around stoves in the one remaining intact room, burning their own fence posts for warmth. He tallied the damage, his heart growing heavier with each entry in his logbook. Amos Weaver's family was at the town hall. The entire back half of their roof was gone. His survey eventually led him to the edge of the yards, to the spur where Kollár had built his folly. Trentham expected to find the boxcar either damaged or more likely abandoned, its foolish resident having fled to shelter with the others. What he saw stopped him dead in his tracks. The boxcar was pristine. It was encased in a thick, perfect sarcophagus of clear ice, 3, maybe 4 inches thick, that glittered in the weak winter sun. There was not a single crack, not a single piece missing. The small stovepipe on the roof puffed a lazy, consistent plume of white smoke into the crystalline air. It was a picture of impossible calm in the midst of chaos. Driven by a curiosity that was stronger than his skepticism, he walked over to it. He put a gloved hand on the steel ladder leading to the roof hatch. He expected the iron to be so cold it would feel like a burn, a vicious, heat-stealing cold that was the signature of all metal in this weather. He braced himself, but the rung was just cold, an inert, passive cold, not the aggressive, biting cold of the tenement door knockers he'd been touching all morning. He climbed. Near the top, a small, well-sealed window had been set into the side of the car. He peered through, his breath instantly frosting the glass. He expected to see a family bundled in every blanket they owned, huddled together for warmth, their faces pinched with misery. What he saw defied everything he knew. He saw a man, Mikuláš Kollár, sitting at a table in his shirt sleeves, reading a newspaper. He saw 2 children playing on the wooden floor with carved toys. He saw a woman, Katerina, stirring a pot on a small stove that glowed with a gentle, controlled heat. It was a scene of placid domesticity, of a normal evening in a normal home. But it was happening inside a metal box, in the heart of a record-shattering cold snap that had broken his town. He climbed down slowly and knocked on the main door. After a moment, Kollár slid the heavy, insulated door open. A wave of stable, dry, impossibly gentle warmth washed over Trentham's face. It didn't feel like the scorching, temporary heat of an overworked stove in a losing battle. It felt like the air itself was warm from floor to ceiling. It was the warmth of a different season. Trentham stepped inside, his eyes taking in the simple pine walls, the clean floor, the quiet efficiency of the space. He looked at the deep door frame, seeing the layers, iron, the dark wool, the interior pine. The reality of it, the sheer, undeniable success of it, hit him with the force of a physical blow. His own house, one of the best built in town, was 45 degrees inside, and his wife was complaining about the cost of the wood they were burning. He pointed to the glass jar on the shelf, where the mother of vinegar was visibly active. "What is that?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "For soup," Mikuláš said simply. "It must stay warm to live." Trentham knew that his wife's vinegar crock, and every other one in Altoona, was frozen into a solid block of brown, useless crystal. It wouldn't be viable again until Easter. This simple, living thing in the jar was the final, irrefutable proof. It was alive, in a world where everything else had frozen. The foreman's face, a mask of professional certainty for 20 years, finally broke. The mockery drained out of him, replaced by a profound and humbling awe. He looked at the space between the inner and outer walls. "My God, Kollár," Trentham said, his voice barely a whisper. "You didn't build a house, you built a ship for winter." Hubert Trentham was, above all, a company man, but he was a good company man. His conversion from skeptic to advocate was total and immediate. He didn't just apologize to Kollár, he championed him. The following Monday, he filed a damage report that was unlike any he had ever written. Alongside the grim accounting of destroyed roofs and frozen pipes, he dedicated 3 pages to a technical description of Kollár's shelter, complete with diagrams he'd made Kollár draw for him. He framed the innovation not as the quirky project of an immigrant, but as a cost-effective, durable, and superior solution for railroad housing. He emphasized the fuel savings, the resilience to high winds, and the speed of construction. The report landed on the desk of a senior engineer in Philadelphia, a man concerned with the soaring costs of maintaining trackside structures along the mountainous main line. The idea of a shelter that was windproof, easy to heat, and built from retired rolling stock, an asset the company already owned, was intensely appealing. By January of 1897, the official Pennsylvania Railroad Shop Manual was updated. A new section appeared. Standard plans for Class 4 trackside section house, Kollár's layered coach pattern. The spread was not immediate, but it was steady. The first 2 prototypes were built along the famous horseshoe curve, where maintenance crews had to endure some of the worst weather on the entire line. The reports that came back were glowing. Crews were warmer, healthier, and consumed less than a third of the coal previously allotted for their shelters. By the end of 1898, 14 Kollár cars, as they came to be known, had been built and deployed along the most exposed sections of PRR track in the Alleghenies. Mikuláš Kollár was hired by the engineering department to oversee their construction. His pay nearly tripled. He never gloated. He simply took the job and did the work, just as he had always done. The principles Mikuláš Kollár applied with wool felt and cork are now cornerstones of modern building science. What he called a layered wall, we now call a building envelope. His obsessive effort to avoid connecting the inner and outer walls with metal fasteners is now a standard practice known as creating a thermal break. Modern construction uses sophisticated plastic or rubber components to achieve this in window frames and curtain walls. But the principle is identical. Stop conduction in its tracks. His design, with its weatherproof outer shell and its insulated inner core, is a perfect 19th century precursor to the concept of outsolation, where a building is wrapped in a continuous exterior layer of insulation. He was a man a century ahead of his time, not because of some visionary genius, but because he applied the proven, hard-won knowledge of his specific trade to a new and desperate problem. The story of Mikuláš Kollár and his boxcar home is more than a tale of ingenuity. It's a profound lesson in redefining a problem. The other settlers in Altoona saw the winter as an enemy to be fought with a bigger fire, a stronger wall. They believed the solution was to build a fortress against the storm. Kollár understood the storm could not be beaten. The wind would always blow, and the cold would always be absolute. So he didn't build walls against the storm. He built a smaller, warmer world inside a bigger metal shell. He didn't fight the winter, he rendered it irrelevant. He created a boundary, not of brute strength, but of intelligent separation. The iron boxcar wasn't the wall. It was merely the shield that kept the world's weather at bay. The real home, the true boundary between his family and the killing cold, was that 6 inches of greasy wool and trapped air. It was a humble, unglamorous, and perfect solution. Thank you for joining me for this piece of forgotten history. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking the video. It makes a huge difference. And I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments. What other modern technologies do you think have their roots in simple, old-world wisdom? The content of this video is for educational and storytelling purposes. It presents a fictionalized narrative inspired by real historical practices and engineering principles. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are products of creative reconstruction. The application of any building techniques, historical or modern, should always be done in accordance with current building codes, safety standards, and regulations. This video does not constitute professional engineering, architectural, or legal advice.